Hello, everyone. My name is Gerard Robinson. I am the Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies and Culture Foundation located in Charlottesville, Virginia. Welcome to the third event sponsored by the Center for Education, Leadership, and Culture. The reason we have conversations about education, leadership, and culture is because we understand two things. That number one, that if we want to inculcate the kind of values into young people and adults that we believe are important to be good stewards and leaders of our public institutions and private as well, then we need to make sure we invest in the type of education that we need. And number two, one way to do that is to bring people together to have conversations about education. As you know, as you follow our work, that we have data from 3,000 high school students and 3,000 parents, and did a deep dive into 10 education ecosystems: public, private, home, virtual, and otherwise. And the data tells us a lot of things, but one in particular for this conversation is that we really want to make sure that young people have the type of education necessary for them to participate not only in elections, but also in the post-election aspect of doing the country's business. And so for that, I have three people with me today who are going to have a conversation with me about it. I've got Peggy Brookins, who's here. She is the president and CEO of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. If you're one of the teachers in the United States or one of the parents or principals who have someone in your classroom who's National Board certified, and we know the great research that shows between having a National Board certified teacher and its impact upon students and the learning culture, you need to thank her for that kind of work. She's also a former teacher in the state of Florida, and so she understands this role of classroom and administration. We have Joanne Weiss, who is former chief of staff to Arne Duncan when he was Secretary of Education for the U.S. Department of Education. She also brings a number of administrative experiences to this conversation, currently running her own LLC, but also working with CSSO, Council of State Chief School Officers, and nonprofit organizations and philanthropic groups who are trying to find ways of doing innovative things in education. So welcome, Joanne, to this conversation. And we also have Javaid Siddiqi, who is the president and CEO of the Hunt Institute in North Carolina. He's the former Secretary of Education for Virginia. He's also a former principal and teacher, so he's seen the classroom inside out, but he's also a former elected local school board member. And as many of us know, a lot of education takes place at the school level and at the board level. They make a lot of decisions, so glad to have him there. As I've done for our first two events, the first one again focused on education and the good, the second one on race, ethics, and virtue, I always ask panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves. People can go to our webpage or your webpage and take a look and learn the great things about you. But I'm interested in knowing, who you are in your journey to this place. So we'll start off with Joanne. Who's Joanne, and what's the journey to get you to this point in life?
Thanks, Gerard. First of all, it's just a pleasure to be here, and I'm so looking forward to the conversation with Peggy and Javaid and you. I have had, at this point, a kind of long and winding career in education that's taken me through the for-profit, nonprofit, public sectors. It's taken me from early childhood to K-12 into higher education, back to K-12, which is really, I think, where my heart is and most of my work has been. And the thread throughout the whole thing has been a constant focus on students, on how they learn, on what they need in order to learn, what they need from adults, what they need from the system. So I really started my career coming to it from the question of how do kids learn. I started in curriculum design and development in K-12, mathematics, ELA, sort of across the main core parts of the curriculum, designing and developing materials to help students learn. It took me from there, and I started in ed tech, developing curriculum for the K-12 market in the very early days of ed tech. Took me from there into the teacher's perspective. What does professional learning look like? And from there, straight into the classrooms of teachers all across the US, and got really a broad view of the horrendous inequities that just pervade the educational system in this country. That kind of brought me up to questions of scale and policy and what are the kinds of things that we could do to impact what's going on inside classrooms and change the conditions for the better. I went to New Schools Venture Fund as part of this sort of journey that I was on, and worked in the very early days of the Charter Management Organization movement, which was really all about creating more just and effective educational systems for kids. And I also, in that role, supported a lot of work with TFA, with new leaders, around trying to bring a more diverse and expert group of teachers and school leaders into education. That then took me to the federal level, where, as you said, I worked in the US Department of Education in the Obama administration. And that is sort of scale at the, big picture level. You take your pen and you impact 50 million students. But one of the things that I also, like, I started in implementation, my heart is in implementation. And I really wanted to sort of get back to that nexus of where teachers, students, and content work together to sort of create the magic of learning and opportunity for kids. So I've been working both at the state level on policy, because I think that's where the big policy impact lives, and in a lot of work around teaching and learning, as you said, with nonprofits who are working directly with districts on these issues.
Thank you. Peggy, same question to you. Who's Peggy?
Wow, these are big questions. And I myself am a lifelong learner, and I spent 38 years in the classroom. My passion is STEM education. And National Board certification is in adult and young adult, adolescent, early mathematics. And thinking about everything that I've done kind of to get me to this point, really focused, like Joanne said, on what is the impact on students. How do I, as the person who is in front of the room or who is leading a school, have that impact and listen and understand the needs of teachers and the needs of students and the needs of communities all at once? And so that led me, I've taught a long time before National Board existed, but when National Board came along, to think about this is an amazing process to enhance what you're doing. It's transformational in nature, and started that journey. And not only for myself, but for, the individuals and the teachers within my school. So as that progressed, there were some things that I was doing before that around professional development, because, if you lead a school, you are also that instructional leader of that school. And you're thinking about the best ways to impact every single child. And I did a lot of professional development in thinking mathematics with the American Federation of Teachers, because I kept seeing this lack. That teachers were not getting what they needed to understand the foundation of mathematics and where it comes from, and to be able to, transfer that over to students in a way that they could understand where they've been, where they are, and lead them to where, they're going. I worked on the Common Core standards. Even in the state of Florida during your tenure, we were both there at the same time, and Florida's push on career academies around the state. So, I received one of those grants to start an engineering school. And the more you got involved and listened to students and listened to teachers, it was content knowledge, pedagogy that was so important in order to take them from where they are to the next step. And National Board provided that. So I began to do that work around the country for as many teachers as possible through AFT. Also worked with NEA. Their priorities and initiatives are exactly the same as that of National Board. And then thinking about, serving on a number of boards around the country to ensure the voice of teachers was a part of the policy landscape, looking at how do we advocate for students in ways and communities that cannot advocate for themselves, and to make sure that teacher voice was always at the table. When I came to the National Board, I came, for two reasons. I also was an Obama appointee on a commission for educational excellence for African Americans, and as well as coming to the National Board. you think about your career and what you've done. I think as somebody who is retired and doing the work that all retired people should do, your passion. And this has been my passion, the National Board for years and years. And now, I'm humbled and get the pleasure of doing this work on a daily basis.
Thank you. Who's Javaid?
First of all, thanks, Gerard, for the kind invitation to join these two dynamic education leaders, Joanne and Peggy. So I think I'll start with more of a personal story because I was not I didn't dream about education growing up. My father came here, immigrated to this country to pursue his PhD. And so he came over. Imagine leaving your parents, his mom specifically, his dad had passed already. And only to know that you're going to see your mom once more in your entire lifetime. That was how important education was to him, to his family. And so naturally, when you think about that sacrifice, it was hard not to follow in that path of being a lifelong learner. I mean, it was sort of ingrained in who we were. 25 years ago, my father ran for school board in an area of Chesterfield, Virginia. He was a professor at Virginia State University, HBCU, so right outside of between Richmond and Petersburg, Virginia. He ran for school board. Back then where we lived, there were three races. There were Black folk, white folk, and then there was Siddiquis. And there were four boys growing up. I say this, mainly to make a point, but truly was sort of our reality at the time. So I never really fit in with one group. I had to insert myself within a variety of groups, learn about different communities. So it never really had my own community. At first, that was a struggle, but it became, later in life, has paid huge dividends. But as a child growing up, you never know where you fit in. It's tough to sort of reconcile that. Also instructed my thinking as I would sort of happen into teaching. Before I get there, I was raised with the idea that you're going to be a doctor. It was really three options: doctors, lawyers, and engineers. And in my community, you're going to be one of these three. Somehow, I don't know if it was a Halloween costume when I was a child that I was put in scrubs. I was like on a track to be going to med school. My junior year of college, I was like, yeah, this med school thing's not for me. But I was sort of committed to this undergraduate degree in biology. And so I mustered the courage, talked to my father. The next thing you know, literally thrust into a classroom with no education background. At the time, it still continues to be challenges in sciences, but not as bad, but it was significant shortage. So I got a probationary teaching license in Virginia. Taught at a high school. I was a 22-year-old kid sitting with 18-year-old kids. It was fascinating thinking about it, but I fell in love with teaching. I fell in love. It was like a drug, when addicted to wanting to have an impact. You saw as a teacher the impact you could have. And so I immediately knew I wanted to scale that impact. And that led from teacher to going back to graduate school, becoming an assistant principal and principal. And, in that time, I was fortunate enough to cross paths with you. And who knows where my life would have been professionally if you and I, Gerard, had not crossed paths. But I did later on get invited to the governor's office and finished as the Secretary of Education. And when you think about a teacher, you have 30 to 150, depending on if you're elementary or high school, the course loads, impact, principal, a couple thousand. Sec ed scale pales into what Joanne's 50 million, but in Virginia is over 1.2 million students. I mean, to think that you have the ability to influence that many young people, it was such an attractive opportunity, and one I'll never forget because of some of the things we did that I knew potentially would have huge impact on their lives. Now, the reality is, from policymakers' standpoint, you don't fully appreciate the impact the way you did and teachers do. If you did this today and you see tomorrow this kid is eating where they hadn't been eating, there was an immediate impact. Putting in a policy around hunger, you don't fully appreciate it because you can't see it. You don't emotionally connect with it. So that was something that I missed working in the governor's office. That's what sort of drove me into running for local office, as you mentioned. In 20 years to the day, my dad ran for school board in the community where, we heard stuff like, well, we'll never put those people in office. He was not successful in running 20 years to the day. I was able to win that seat. not in the same district, but in the same county. And so there was some progress being made, not enough, but I had built enough partnerships and relationships on the local level that folks saw that it was a value proposition. That was really what ultimately drove me. I wanted to be able to have that continued local impact, that impact in my own community or local context. Today, though, I have the privilege of serving as the president at the Hunt Institute. We've created by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt, mainly to serve education policy needs of governors, state lawmakers, other senior elected state officials. And what makes me effective in this role, I think, is my previous experience as a teacher, principal, certainly the Secretary of Education. I believe in the work we're doing, but I keep going back to the relationships I form making an impact for our children. I think that's why I continue to advocate for our children across the entire country.
Thank you, Javaid. And thank you for all of you for sharing personal stories, because I'm sure I'm going to get an email or text saying, I didn't know that about so-and-so. So that's why I always like to open up with a personal story. So Jan, let's start with you. You were in the Department of Education. It's one of the 15 federal cabinets that we have here in the US, with there likely to be a nice new transition coming in place. You arrived during a transition as well. So for those of us who only know the Department of Education as a concept, talk to us about what the next 100 days will look like as people are thinking about Department of Ed, policies, and staffing.
Sure. This is not like prior 100-day transition periods, partly because normally right now is the transition period when a lot of work is happening, where one administration is doing a very, very structured handoff to another administration. You literally put together binders of information, sit down with the people coming in from the new administration and do a very structured pass off of information about everything that's in progress, how things are structured, who's in charge of which divisions, what's moving, what needs to move, et cetera. None of that's happening right now. So the transition team, which, there is a transition team that the Biden administration has put together, and they're doing a lot of work in isolation to get themselves set up and ready to take over. Luckily, obviously, Biden knows a lot about government, so he doesn't have the same kind of learning curve that a new to government kind of president would have. So that's lucky, but still none of the structured handoff is going on, which means that the first 100 days are going to have that to worry about. In addition, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so there's a lot of work that's going to have to go on around that. So I would say that the big work that's going to go on during the first 100 days is, first of all, a very close collaboration between the CDC and the Department of Education to really figure out what guidance should look like for districts and higher education around both conditions for reopening based on different levels of transmission and all of the safety precautions that need to be put into effect, and distribution and dissemination systems to get all of those safety materials and testing down to the folks who need them. So I think there's going to be a whole new body of work coordinating all of that. Then there's going to be all of the sort of normal work that happens around reviewing all of the regulations, executive orders, and other things that are moving, because there's a certain period of time when you can roll back things that are maybe brand new and have just happened, and the administration might choose to roll back some new things, and you need to know which things those are. And then you have to start making decisions about which things you want to leave in place, which things you want to change, and what your new priorities are. And then on top of that, the Department of Education has lost literally hundreds of career staff. And I think this is actually consistent across many, many federal agencies right now. But the context I know is the Department of Education, and they're down hundreds of people. So rebuilding the agency, hiring, structure, processes, culture, getting a new senior executive staff in place. The career people are the glue. They're not only the glue that holds it together across administrations, but they run things, they implement things. They're absolutely critical to the functioning of government. And right now we're in a very dire situation, honestly, where we have to, in order to get good government back up and running, really rebuild and strengthen those agencies. And so that's going to be a huge focus for the administration in the first 100 days, because they're coming into a pretty severely crippled agency.
And thanks for highlighting the importance of the Department of Ed working with other agencies, departments, and institutes, because education is not delivered by the Department of Ed alone. We know we have the Department of Agriculture and others who play a big role. So thanks for that. And also about the importance of career staff. You know, a number of people who are going to come on are going to be political appointees, but the ones who have, you know, gone to sleep and woken up across administrations, Democrat and Republican, have been the career. So thanks for bringing that to play. Peggy, let's go to you. And in your opening, you did a wonderful job of talking about your career and why you wanted to make sure that the voices of teachers matter. And you're continuing that right now as your job as president and CEO. You and I have had conversations about the work that you've done with governors in terms of how they can do a better job with their students. Mississippi is one example that you've shared with me before. Talk to us about the work that you're doing and why you decided to do it.
That work is very dear to us, and it is work that we've carried on for years. And I just want to start by thinking about a stat that just kind of blows people away. Michael Nettles, who is also a member of our White House Commission, said in one of our first meetings that 75% of all African-American children live in 12 states. And, you know, when you think about that and you think about where those states are, the majority of them sit in the Black Belt, what we call, know what the Black Belt is. And Mississippi, has a large number of those states. And at the time, Governor Bryant, thinking about what education means and historically, who has had access to education, you have to start to think about, we must educate every citizen that we have in order to remain economically viable. And that's one of the reasons he was so, supportive of national board certification, because of the impact on students. One of his major priorities was reading and literacy, especially at third grade. And we know if you cannot read by third grade, how that is compounded throughout a child's career and the deficits that occur year by year. So one of the things the governor did, which was incredibly smart, was to move, the support of National Board from the educational side to the economic side of his budget. And what that gave us the opportunity to do was to work with something called the World Class Teaching Program. And in that program, no teacher in the state of Mississippi is more than an hour away from one of those institutions. And within those institutions, National Board partnered with them to look at pre-service teachers who were in the field, particularly in literacy, and started working with them their junior year of pre-service all the way through their national board certification, and focused on literacy. The other thing we did was to think about how do we get teachers who are not yet in the process also involved in this work. So the Kellogg Foundation funded a priority that we had. And what that was that we took students who had not passed the third grade reading gate and put them with a nationally board certified teacher for 68 weeks in the summer, and then tested those students after spending 6 to 8 weeks with that nationally board certified teacher in literacy, and 85% of those students passed that reading gate. And then in the afternoon, what we were doing was taking, having those teachers look on and start to pick up, strategies, learn different pedagogies around how this literacy teaching would be best embedded in their work. So, they too garnered a different set of heuristics to take back with them. So that compounded everything. And, then having an incentive for teachers to become board certified once we know the impact on students, and now seeing, the governor put out a PSA. Governor Bryant put out a PSA before he left office, and then Governor Reeves has now put out a PSA. And I have to give due credit to Carrie Wright, who gets it all, who takes it and puts it all together to make it work, and to have Mississippi now, be ranked #1 in NAEP. The progress that they are making, and there's more progress to be made, but that progress is showing itself in ways that, you can't even imagine. We have now since put together a network of accomplished teachers within Mississippi as well to spread the wealth around mentorships. We know we have research around mentors, and that's fairly new research for us, thinking about a group of early career teachers who were mentored by nationally board certified teachers. The students of those early career teachers gain 6.5 months of learning. And that's in this 9-month period. So we have data about what works. We have data about the impact of board certification. We have data about the impact of cohorts going through the process. And, Governor Bryant said at the time, for every dollar he spent, he got a $31 return, because, those stats are saying you are 31% more likely to pass the 3rd grade reading gate if you have a national board certified teacher. So think about if you had a nationally board certified teacher in every content area, in every school, at every grade level, or if you had a national board certified teacher your entire, career. And that's what we want to do, is put a board certified teacher in front of every child in this country. So that is what we are doing in Mississippi. We continue to do that, want to do it in different states around the country, but we know it's working, and we continue to do that work to this day. And the other piece of that work that we're doing is advocacy, teacher voice. So we have a group of champions who are out all over the state of Mississippi, who are talking about board certification, giving people access, knowledge, and the ability to be a part of a cohort. The governor has also added a second incentive in those areas that need it the most, where he has the most high need schools. So we're bringing teachers there as well. So we are so proud of that work and what teachers in the state of Mississippi are doing.
That's incredible on a number of fronts. I mean, I think about symbols and symbolism. The fact that the governor decided to make education a part of an economic conversation was a signal to those in the economic development community and outside and inside of education. This is important. That's one reason some other governors over the years have taken early childhood learning and moved it under a governor's office, or made it a part of an initiative the governor decided to support. And frankly, we often know that we hear Mississippi, it's always for the negative things. And the fact that you could say #1 in NAEP is good to see Mississippi on the other side of the ledger for this. So thank you for that. Javaid, let's go to you. You work weekly with state level leaders across the country, education, economic development, business, even presidents and provosts and others. As you're thinking about those who are going to be in the U.S. Department of Education, all state level leaders are always concerned about regulations and what they look like. What recommendations would you like to share with those who are going to be in a position of power on how they can support the work state level leaders are doing in education as it relates to either regulatory relief or regulatory innovation?
That's a great question. So we, as you mentioned, we are constantly meeting with legislators, Hunt-Kean Fellows, which are attorneys generals, lieutenant governors, researchers, families, students. I can tell you that COVID-19 and our current racial reckoning across the country has had a disastrous impact on student learning. The pandemic alone has resulted in large drops in public school enrollment, as I know you all are familiar with, across the country. Florida, for example, 12% in Miami-Dade, 14% decline in Broward County in kindergarten enrollment. I don't know how they begin to sort of reconcile that. Researchers are now predicting that our students have lost more than 1/3 of their academic year in reading instruction and half a year in math. So when you think back to 2017-18, about 30% of our four-year colleges were declining in tuition revenue compared to 2009-10. And now in the midst of the pandemic, states are preparing to make budget cuts and colleges are being forced to lay staff off just to keep themselves from shutting down. So in the midst of all this, we are still in a crisis mode because our children, our loved ones are also at risk of catching this disease. So right now, what I think we need is bold and decisive action on part of our state governments and our federal leadership in supporting young people. Setting a bold course could be a much needed investment in early childhood education and care. I mean, I think that could be huge. It's hard for me to say that the $3.5 billion that Congress gave the entire childcare industry is less than 6% of what Boeing received. So we need bold leadership. Bold leadership would be stepping up to fund childcare, a sector that American communities now have, I think, eyes wide open, have come to rely on to keep children safe and to make sure they're being prepared, appropriately as they proceed to K-12. The economic impact, though, allowing families to go to work, the child care industry has been lifted up. And so I hope we seize that opportunity to really draw more attention to it. Early childhood education is also an investment in our future. Research clearly shows that the quality of childhood programs have long-term positive effects on children and certainly the society at large. So as educators, we know that we can't just fix economic challenges in the country if we don't fix the education challenges. So leadership can also include having courageous conversations about what assessments for our students should look like. We just had Secretary Spellings and Secretary Duncan, along with Superintendent Carvalho and Chancellor Carranza on a webinar last week. And this came up, this idea of removing testing again for a second consecutive year. We know we need to meet our students where they are, especially right now, but we cannot sort of acquiesce to low expectations for their learning. So my work has taught me that policymakers cannot be in this fight alone. We need voices of educators, we need families, we need students. We need all of that sort of coalition to help guide the process. But we do have the opportunity to show up our system for it to be what it should be, what it can be, and frankly, as Governor Hunt always says, what it must be for our youngest learners. So I think those are a few thoughts that I would offer to this conversation.
Those were some really great statistics, sad in terms of learning loss in reading and math, and we know that's going to particularly hit vulnerable populations, not only urban area, but rural areas as well. And I think about one of our other colleagues who spoke at my first event, Eric Hanushek. He published a piece on the economic loss that COVID is having, not only in the United States, but across the board. So Joanne, I want to go back to you, Department of Education, when you were there as a leader. You guys did some really bold things there. One of the initiatives you actually took on was closing the number of dropout factories that we had in the country, and you moved that needle in the right place. You also reauthorized what initially was the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now Every Student Succeeds Act, Herculean effort because it had languished unresolved for a number of years. As we look at going into 2021, higher education, HEA still finds itself in the same boat. What are some ideas that you would put forward in terms of maybe a landmark piece of legislation or a landmark program an administration could put forward to really do something big and bold?
I think there's sort of two ways to answer your question, Gerard, because one way is the pragmatic way, which is to say, very honestly, I don't think there's going to be a big legislative agenda for education, given what's going to happen in the Senate and the House with the very tight margins, no matter who ends up with control of the Senate. So I think that beyond ensuring that stimulus funding, because I do think I hope something has to move around stimulus funding. And I think that there should be a significant piece of that that's dedicated to education. I mean, it is clear that schools not only are critical to kids' future, and those statistics, Javaid, that you gave about learning loss are even more horrifying when you realize it's only November. Like, we have a long way to go in this, and we are spending a lot of time churning in education and not actually teaching. Like, we haven't gotten to the teaching and learning part in so many places because there's so much churning going on. So I think there has to be a stimulus part of, an education part of any stimulus package that's pretty significant and really provides some funding to help schools, and some clear guidance on when it's safe to reopen and how to protect all of the staff and kids who are in those places. So I think that's an important thing. Beyond that, I personally am not sure that thinking about, like, what are the great, huge, big ideas at the federal level, I'm not sure it's time for that in this country. I think that the bully pulpit in education is important. And I think that whoever is the secretary has to use their communications platform to great effect. And I think that, as you pointed out, when you were talking about reauthorizing ESEA, it came out of the Civil Rights Act. The federal government's role in education comes out of equity. That's its roots, and that's what the federal government's role is primarily about. And so I think using the bully pulpit of any new administration to really talk about what it means to make sure that every student gets the opportunity and access to a great education is going to be critical. And I know that just sounds like words. I think we need to put ideas behind that. We need to spotlight where it works and what it looks like. We need to focus more on teaching and learning and what it means to really help teachers and students succeed in those classrooms. But I'm not sure that there's like a big policy move at the federal level, to be honest, at the moment.
No, that's the kind of straight talk we all should listen to, because you've been in the seat, you've looked at the dynamics in the Senate in particular, and it may be a challenge. So thanks for sharing that. Peggy, you've done a great job of making sure teachers' voices are at the table, and now you're pushing to make sure we diversify the teaching force itself. Majority of teaching force, women, mostly white women, but mostly whites across the board. You're now working to diversify not only the teaching force, but those who are national board certified. I had a chance to attend a wonderful dinner you had in Washington, D.C., met some really bright, smart people who want to do some things in different ways. Talk to us about that project.
Yes, that is near and dear to me at the National Board and the work that we do around the country. So those individuals that came together and you were part of the dinner is thinking about how do all of these diverse, incredible leaders around the country come together, partner, and to ensure that the pipeline is there for teachers of color. Thinking about what does it mean to enter this profession? How are you supported in that work? And, I think about our work and partners with the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity and working with Cassandra Herring in her new center of taking, starting with HBCUs, because we know, how many teachers come out of HBCUs that are teachers of color and where they teach around this country, to say, how do we take the 5 core propositions, embed that work along with the ability to see what an accomplished teacher looks like, so we know what that North Star is, and begin that work not only with pre-service teachers, but to begin that work with those who teach pre-service teachers, to understand, if only, you think about, most people teach the way they were taught. And if those who are teaching were teaching in that way that, they exemplified the 5 core propositions, we would be well ahead of the game. And that is what Cassandra is doing at her center, to think about reimagine higher ed, not to just flip it upside down, but to reimagine it in ways that it is meeting the current reality of K-12. And not to be, the old model that was out there. And she's doing a fantastic job of that. She's also using our platform called Atlas, Accomplished Teaching, Learning in Schools, in order to be a part of the pre-service experience, looking at 4 developmental levels and just about everything that a teacher would teach in order to see a theory in practice. So let's take the INTAS standards. Let's say if I'm talking to you and I'm the professor and I'm talking about INTAS standard 8 and you're sitting there thinking, okay, you're telling me about it, but I don't know what that looks like in practice. And then when I'm the teacher of record, I don't even know what I'm looking for, even in my internship in this classroom. Atlas does that for you. It allows that professor and that teacher to sit down and take a deep dive into what their expectations are, what it looks like in practice, and how they can become that teacher that everybody wants in front of their child. So the collection of those individuals, and that's just one example, but the collection of those individuals who were there for that convening also focused on, male teachers of color. So right now, yesterday, we had a meeting. We're going to host a webinar series starting in January focused on male teachers of color, because we know that there are, only 2% of the teaching population right now, and only 6% of the population in general. And how do we talk about the need to have, that role model within classrooms and the importance of what it means to those students and their future. And we know the research behind that. And the other piece of that is for us to support teachers through this process. So we created what we call NAME. It's the Network of Accomplished Minoritized Educators. And those educators are NBCTs who have come together as a national group, and they support teachers of color through the process. It's kind of anybody who wants an affinity group in order to expand, their knowledge, to transform their practice in this way, has that support system. We have it for anybody, but particularly for those people who want to do it in that way. This can be a scary process to begin with for some people until they understand what the process is. And then they say, oh my God, why did I wait so long? Those are a few of the things that we're doing, but looking at our board, our board is 50% minority, 51% educators. And, we kind of practice what we preach in that way.
No, that's very good. I'm also glad you mentioned about diversity in terms of also gender, trying to get more men in the teaching profession. My first job when I graduated from Howard was becoming a 5th grade school teacher in Los Angeles. And for a number of the students who I remained in contact with, they said I was the only male teacher they had in elementary school, but for some, all the way through school, minus athletic director or someone in that level. And that's not making a comparison, it's just making a note. So thanks for the work that you're doing. So Javaid, wearing your former hat as an elected official, no matter who's in the White House, people want to make sure their children aren't in the outhouse. And the closest person to them is often their local elected official. What are some things that local elected officials should think about telling families, taxpayers, those even without children in the public school system or any school system? What can they do right now to better support education at the local level, at this point?
So let me start off by saying how grateful I am to not be currently holding the seat on local school board. I wouldn't wish a local school board seat on my worst enemy, because this pandemic has been a disaster, and there is no right answer. You hear from families and parents, I'm sending my kid back. Well, I'm going to do hybrid, or I'm going to stay virtual. There is no right or wrong answer. There's a family choice. I think the more we look at the science, the more we look at the districts having to provide leadership. And I think that's what I would want to see from our next from the administration and the next secretary, is some leadership. As of 2018, there are 13,500 school districts, 90,000 school board members in this country. Now, think about how many of them have a professional background in medicine or public health. I think Joanne hit it on the head earlier. The secretary, whoever he or she ends up becoming, will need to work hand in glove with his or her counterpart, Health and Human Services, because the federal government has to provide leadership to states who in turn have to provide leadership to the local education agencies. And I think that leadership breakdown is putting families in positions where they're having to make choices with limited information or misinformation, or even worse, and we see it oftentimes where they make decisions and the rules of engagement change in the middle of the game. So we're going to send kids home once it gets over. If we have a spike, well, not quite there. We're going to maybe we're going to wait for the spike to get to 10%. So, we don't know what it is. And I think that is a byproduct of not having leadership. So a lot of education and state leaders who have been looking to the federal department to provide meaningful support, and it just hasn't been there. I'm hopeful that will not be the case. From what I've seen already from some of the transition team members that have been assembled, and from the way the president-elect has responded with this coronavirus task force, I think that's not going to be the case. I'm hopeful that in fact won't be the case. That said, to be fair, there's no magic bullet for dealing with all the challenges these leaders are facing. Closest thing that I would encourage local leaders to do is continue to be focused on listening to experts in your community, local public health officials, state public health officials. They tend to have the best data, right, based on the local and regional context, and then certainly building relationships so you can articulate whatever information is coming in a very timely, transparent way. That is what you hear from families. We don't even know what the science, the data is telling us. Families deserve that. Students deserve that. Teachers deserve to know what the data is saying, because they're being asked to go into harm's way. I mean, they're essentially frontline workers now. So one other thing we've talked about already here today is never had to face before, but people looking for meaningful guidance. School boards, both state boards, districts, have a lot of uncertainties that they're facing right now. They don't know what the funding, what enrollment, or federal accountability is going to look like. These things matter. They matter a ton. Despite the current pandemic, we can't lose sight of how big the gaps were between our low income and our wealthy students before these disruptions, and we know that they're only going to get worse. We need bold leadership across all sectors and levels. We need federal leaders to give clarity, to leverage the full breadth and expertise of the federal government. When Joanne talks about the gutting of the classified staff, and I recall going into DOE US Ed 3 years back, and it was a ghost town. And I thought, well, where are all the classified folks that are supposed to be carried over? Because that's the institutional knowledge. That is going to be something to reckon with, having to rebuild. And hopefully many of those folks will come back in. We don't know, but hopefully, because I can only imagine the challenge that the next secretary is going to have to deal with, trying to build internally in order to provide leadership externally. Again, wouldn't wish that on anybody. I also personally think we need to invest more in building a pipeline of education leaders of color. Gerard, grateful that you were on a panel recently with us at the Institute that focused specifically on this topic. We are working right now as an institute with North Carolina Governor Cooper, the DRIVE Task Force, developing a representative and inclusive vision for education. He's trying, in the state of North Carolina, trying to diversify the workforce, because we all know the research is very clear. Students of color tend to do better when we have a more representative workforce. We're now trying to scale this task force, we're about to put out a report in the coming days on the first year of this task force, and then we'll hopefully iterate on this. But we're trying to scale this model and then also take it beyond just educators, teacher diversity, looking at leaders of color, both building leaders, district leaders, and certainly superintendents, because we need to get more Black superintendents, Hispanic superintendents. We need to flood the market, because when you have a few that rise up, they tend to they write their own ticket. We need to build and deepen the pool. There's too many communities that are not being served by leaders that are representative of that specific community. So that work is near and dear. And I think diverse communities need to be given a chance to make a difference. So I'm looking forward to getting that scaled up. But at the end, right now, we need a secretary who believes in making evidence-based decisions, building relationships, and listening to leaders' needs.
when you talk about your work at the local level and the importance of the health commissioner, probably most people in your district, my district, otherwise, probably couldn't name who his or her health profession director, leader. We just couldn't. And today, very different. So those two worlds are coming in place. So before I turn it over to the audience, and I'll say that if you have a question, just raise your virtual hand. I will call on you, and then someone from our team will unmute, and then you'll be able to ask a question. Before I do that, I want to give you guys an opportunity to answer one question as a group. All of you are entrepreneurs. Joanne, you talked about your early work in ed tech, the early part of the charter school movement. You know, we know you, Peggy, you helped actually create a school. And so that was an entrepreneurial endeavor. Javaid, you not only had to run a different type of middle school, but you've been a policy entrepreneur. So wearing your entrepreneurial hat, we know that every tragedy creates a triumph. What do you think is going to come out of COVID-19 that's going to make us do something different about teaching and learning and education, both K-12 and higher ed? And whoever wants to go first, feel free.
I can start. One of the things I've seen and what COVID has brought to light that we knew was there, but now we can't ignore, is inequities in technology, broadband services, and the quality of teaching and learning. And we cannot say we don't know anymore, because we do. We cannot say who has, is having the greatest impact, because we do. And I think one of the ways that we have begun to reach teachers and service their needs based on what they're telling us they need is through technology. I think the idea of using this technology space in ways that we have in the last 7 months won't go away, and it shouldn't go away for a lot of the needs that can be expressed in ways that weren't there before. And I'll just focus on one of them: parent-teacher conference. Every child now can have a parent-teacher conference with their parents and themselves and their teacher, at a different time of the day. It doesn't have to be between 3 and 3:45. It doesn't, a parent doesn't have to drive anywhere to get there. They can do it from their phone as they're, driving, I won't say driving, riding home as a passenger in a car. They can do it in so many different settings that, weren't there before. So this engagement with teachers and communities and students and, whoever we need to engage with, look at all of us on this screen. We are able to do and engage with so many more people than we ever would if we had to travel. So I think that's the one great thing that has come out of this.
Thank you.
So I will jump in and agree with that. Like, I think this question of what's going to rise from the ashes of this experience that we've had over the last year is a very, very important question to ask. And in addition to the new pervasiveness and comfort with technology, which I think that's super important, there's a few other trends that I think are really important. I'll just call one of them out, which I think is parent involvement. Parents are inside classrooms. Parents have never really been inside classrooms. They're in there now. And they're seeing things that delight them, and they're seeing things that horrify them, and they're seeing things that make them think that they want a totally different experience for their kids. But we have talked for a long time in education about parent choice. And I think we thought about it as private school choice, charters as choice, traditional districts as choice. Like, we in education made these sectors up that really don't mean very much to parents. They certainly meant a lot in education reform conversations, but they don't really mean much to parents. Parents are now exercising choice in brand new ways. And a choice is, I want my kid to stay all virtual. What are you going to do to really support them well? Or I need my kid to come back in because I need childcare and I'm an essential worker, and how are you supporting my kid? And parents are blurring all these sector lines that we've created and saying, here's what I need, how are you going to deliver it? And by the way, that quality of education that I hear coming into my house, into my living room, that is not acceptable. That is not what it looks like to educate my child. And I know that, and that is not okay with me. What are we going to do about it? And if you don't, what am I going to do to fix it for my kid? And I think we're empowering every teacher. Like, we used to talk about this as the wealthy and privileged conversations, because I'll just exit the system and put my kid in private school. I think we're going to have parents up in arms at every level of society saying, here's what I need for my kid. How are you going to deliver it? And it's going to be very interesting to see if traditional districts can rise to this occasion.
When you just mentioned your last point, I thought of a book I read in grad school about exit, voice, and loyalty. We're going to see that in a really interesting way now in practical sense. Javaid.
So I'll think about the 3 points, because I can't help but to make points for all three important sectors. I think early childhood education, the conversation around really states building out dedicated funding streams, so we're not hitting and missing depending on revenues year to year. That we see this supporting our youngest learners as equally important as we see our K-12 learners. Obviously, I think we have work to do with funding K-12. Nevertheless, we need to build out dedicated funding streams for early education. Families saw from this pandemic closures, there's going to be tons of providers that are not going to reopen their doors post the pandemic because they were not able to sustain the financial hardship set upon them. I think when you think about K-12, we need to stop thinking about broadband separate and apart. It has to be considered a utility. We're consuming its electricity, water, data. Those are requisites for the current families and households. And government needs to figure out a way to make sure broadband is accessible, both infrastructure, but also accessible from a financial standpoint, because it is something that I think is going to be necessary. And then lastly, for our friends in higher education, I think there's some interesting, for me, I think promising, but I think a lot of people are going to think it's interesting around the Biden-Harris plan around student debt. I think there's something to be said about that, worthy of further exploration. I can't wait for the debates around this to ensue. But the pandemic specifically, I think we would be remiss not to talk about the impact the pandemic's had on, especially community college, certainly four-year, but community college, I think especially providing food and shelter, because there's a lot of young people that were going hungry and are certainly homeless, and the pandemic has sort of shined a light on some of those issues across the higher education community.
Hey, Gerard, can I jump in with one more that Peggy touched on quickly, but I think is worth just highlighting, which is the role of community organizations and communities vis-a-vis schools. Like, schools and communities have always been sort of loosey-goosey partners with one another. You know, the community did the after-school stuff and whatever. But now I think communities are having to lean in, and schools are having to lean in ways that they haven't before. Schools are feeding everybody 3 meals a day in a lot of communities. Communities are providing places for kids to go every day when remote learning is happening and the kid can't stay at home, either because they don't have internet access or because their parents are essential workers or there's no family members there to watch over them. There's all kinds of brand new partnerships being forged. And I think one of the things that we have done to the detriment of education is said that schools were responsible for everything in the world that they don't have control over. But the truth is that there's often community organizations in those communities that can help. Health organizations, care organizations, nutrition organizations, and mental health as well as physical health. And I think if we can really cement some of these partnerships in new ways after the pandemic, it will just be a boon to communities to provide integrated supports and services between schools and these community-based organizations on behalf of the kids in the communities.
That's what I call the Noah approach. Once the ship landed, or even before it took off, you had to come in, they say 2 by 2, but it's the partnership. So that part is really true. Well, we've come to the part where we're actually going to allow people to ask questions. I already have one in Bay. I saw Toya Smith. She had a electric hand up initially. Toya, are you still there? And do you want to ask your question? So I see no hand from her. Oh, she says yes. So Dan, if we can, so we'll go ahead and take care of so unmute yourself when you can, and we'll do the same on our side.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Toya Smith. I'm a senior at Dillard University and really interested in education and the intersection between law and policy. So this conversation has been really valuable for me today to hear from you all. My question is specifically surrounding parents. I feel like this pandemic is hitting our kids hard, but parents are having to figure out ways to be educators, teach, assist, and they certainly don't want their kids to fall behind. And so I'm wondering if you all have had any like policy or even just practical community engagement solutions to help mend that gap.
Thank you. That's to anyone.
I think one of the ways is to provide, using this technology space again, help for parents on how they go about helping their children at home. NASTY board certified teachers, it's ingrained in the 5 core propositions, core prop 5, in what they do. And it is a focus on that collaboration with parents to understand students so much better than they already do. And those parents know their children. The teacher has a different relationship with those children, but that trichotomy, put it together and you have just created, the perfect sauce for saying, the teacher, the parent, and the student are all in here to make sure the student receives exactly what they need. So providing support for parents, it's kind of easy to send things home, send things by email, give them certain websites to view with their children. You can give them different websites that have extra learning that are associated with that website, or tutorials that are associated. And we've seen that parents are learning along with their children as well and enjoying that experience. So I think that's one way we can begin.
Okay. I also see a question from Kimberly Robinson. If you're still on, you can feel free to ask your question, just raise a virtual hand. And if not, then I'll go ahead and ask the question on your behalf. So in not seeing that, the question is, how can we convince governors, mayors, and officials to prioritize reopening and keeping schools open rather than keeping restaurants, bars, and gyms open during the pandemic? What should a Biden administration do to address the issue? Open to anyone.
I do see Kimberly there. I don't know whether she wants to add anything else.
I see her now. So we'll go ahead, if you can unmute yourself, and then we'll unmute on our end, and then you can ask your question. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, it's really just about thinking about how we're approaching the pandemic compared to, European countries are, doing things like closing restaurants and bars, but keeping schools open. And I'm just trying to understand how we can shift the conversation to make education the priority over other services that are being kept open.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in on this one because I do think that it is, the way we've been handling this in this country is just so inept compared with the decisions that a lot of countries in Europe have been making about education. And part of the problem is that all these problems are interrelated. It is a very good soundbite to say, how dare we keep bars open and close schools? But the truth behind that statement is that the economic well-being of cities is in huge jeopardy. And that's kind of what is fighting against the school reopening discussion. And so stimulus money that allows bars to close and waiters and waitresses and bartenders to still be paid or still get unemployment insurance that keeps the lights on and the heat on in their places is critical to being able to close down the parts of the economy that need to close down according to the science, in order to keep the parts of the economy open that could stay open, including schools, which we know are actually much lower transmission risks than bars are. So by just having a complete lack of guidance and lack of information, as Javaid said, a big lack of leadership around this, we have let so much misinformation fly, and we have just done such a disservice to both economies and to learning as a result of this whole pandemic that it's just kind of shocking and horrifying. What we can do is have clear guidance, again, not mandates, because every community has different transmission rates and needs to make decisions for themselves. But if we had clear guidance that said, here are the transmission rates in communities as they relate to schools, and what you should do to keep schools open or closed for different age kids, because we know that the numbers look, you know, the transmission rates and the risk for kids looks very different for high school kids, for example, than it does for younger students. If we had good data that superintendents could reliably use to make decisions, and we coupled it with a stimulus package that both allowed mayors and governors to make decisions about their communities that involved closing down pieces of the economy that are high risk and need to be closed down, we would be in so much better shape right now. And if on top of it, we coupled it with really a distribution system that got the right PPE and testing to the people who need it at the right time, we'd be in excellent shape. Not excellent shape. We'd be in much better shape than we are. So I think there are solutions, and they start with honest data-based policy.
Gerard, I'll just quickly add, because you know, whole thing has been hyper political. So I'm hopeful that now that the presidential election has come and gone, that it won't be as big a deal on the media, and the partisanship will subside. Unfortunately, as you and I both live in Virginia, we know we're going to be thrown right in. We're already now in the throes of a gubernatorial campaign. And so I am confident this is going to be an issue around school openings or closures. And we saw, you know, I have dear friends that are both Republican and Democrats, and some of my Democratic friends were really wound up that their kids weren't allowed to go back in school. And that became an issue. They started leaning towards Trump. How would you ever vote for Trump if you're a Democrat? And vice versa. Some Republicans that are looking at the science, well, why can we send our kids back? I'm going to go with Biden. So it became hyper political. I think, again, Joanne's right. The lack of information, we just need to know what the science is telling us. And then we can make decisions from that. If our number one objective is to make sure kids' learning ensues, then we need to, again, goes back to that point I made earlier, broadband has to be built out. We have to jump on that right away. That could be easily something built into a stimulus package. But the nexus between education and public health, I think we're going to be a better government, a better people, and a better set of leaders from it, all the way down from president down to mayors, to Joanne's point, because people have become educated. And Gerard, you said it best earlier, nobody knew who their local public health director was 10 months ago. We just didn't know. I mean, no disrespect to any of them, because they're all doing great and important work pre-COVID. As you know, I had to endure something called Legionella a year ago, Gerard. So this is something that just has unfortunately become hyper partisan. And I don't know that, I think things might be changing now. I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful.
And Javaid, just to put a fine point on what you said, I think the partisanship, the politicization has been on both sides. There's a really interesting couple of slides that the Center for Reinventing Public Education out of the University of Washington put together. One slide shows all of the schools in all the districts in the US that have kept schools open in all of the places where the science said those schools should have been shut down. And you've got all these red dots. And then they showed all the schools that are open. And you've got all these, and then they showed all the schools that are open in places where the science says they should be closed. Those are the red dots. And then they've got all the schools that are closed in places where the science says they should be open. Those are all the blue dots, and they're almost equal. Like, people are just behaving in a hyper-political way, not a science-based way on both sides here. And we need to really try our best to come back to the data and the evidence and use that to help guide the decisions, and we'll be much better off.
Peggy, would you like to weigh in on any of this?
I pretty much agree with everything that's been said. My focus is always on, how this has impacted students. And one of the things I think about is truth in advertising, truth in news, and teaching our children to think critically is so important so that they make the right decisions. And I'm just asking that of adults in this case, because it is the only way we're going to get out of this. It has nothing to do with policy. And as an educator who is, of the Medicare card carrying type, there are lots of educators in this country who are the same age, and to protect those individuals and to protect students in schools and those students going home to people who are vulnerable, we need to pay attention to the science and to the facts.
Peggy, the point you just mentioned made me think about some of the debates I heard when governors were given money to support education and divide it up as need be. There was some concern that money was going to childcare workers and those who were in that space, and not as much to teachers on one side of the fence. So even within the family, there was like, so wait a minute, what about us? Well, you're bringing up the point about, let's look at age and let's look at vulnerability. And then Joanne, we remember when we had a crisis with the economy. It wasn't a pandemic, but you helped support the American Recovery Act. And that money was used, in fact, for school systems to actually rehire teachers who were let go because of that. And I would just say, I mentioned that in part, so as we're thinking about what we're going through now for educators, let's go back 2008, 9, 10, and see what the federal government, Department of Ed, local and state leaders had to do, because a lot of teachers were impacted, and part of that money that we supported at the state level was used to rehire teachers. And then Javaid, the part about the hyper-partisanship. Here at the Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture, go to our webpage. We just released a study. We talked about democracy and darkness and just the partisanship. And how much of this is just me saying it, how much of the question about science is a spillover of questions about the climate, which has been around for over a decade. And so these are some things we've got to deal with. Well, we're 3 minutes from closing. I don't see a hand up right now. So I did have one last question. It'll be the closing question. We have one professor who was unable to make it. She teaches inside of a juvenile justice center. And we know that we have approximately 55,000 young people across the country who are in a residential setting. Like to know what recommendations you have to educators who are working inside of juvenile justice facilities. What can we think about the work they're doing? Because there's a COVID aspect there. There's a school to prison pipeline aspect. What could 2021 possibly bring for them?
Let me jump in here because I have a friend who actually works in the space and is a school principal for a detention center. And having been on a local school board, I can speak to what it means. But I think the criminal justice reform should come first. Like, we need to start thinking about, no different than we're thinking about it from adults, 18 plus. What are we putting young people, under 18-year-old, what are we putting them behind bars for? What is it that is the sort of that threshold that this kid needs to go and be behind bars? So certainly there's some things that I think will continue to be in existence, but with this pandemic, I think there's been a lot of progress, a lot of movement. You've seen districts, you've seen states, governors that have been releasing young people and certainly adults based on the type of criminal activity they displayed that led them to those housing arrangements. So I think that is something that will be a policy conversation post-pandemic, another byproduct of the pandemic that I think we can leverage. what is it we're expelling kids for? What is it we're suspending kids for? Because the kid didn't just magically end up in a detention center or jail. There were some behaviors, some triggers all along the way, which goes back to, and I'm going to beat this dead horse for the last time, I promise, the investment in early education. The sooner we can invest in these young people, the less likely they're going to make their way into the system. So criminal justice reform and early childhood education investments, two big points I'd like to make on that question.
I think also when you talk about early childhood, investing in those who are part of early childhood, the training that they receive, the pay that they receive, they have those students at the most vulnerable and when they learned the most. So I think that we support those people who are part of centers, who are in classrooms as paras, to further their education so that they can also have a greater impact on students.
Well, we've come to a close. Joanne, I want to thank you for giving us a peek into what the U.S. Department of Education looks like, its work across agencies, its importance on what it can and cannot do. Thanks for the reality check that, you know what, this just may not be the lottery for public policy or major bold changes just because of where we're in right now. And so we appreciate that. And also for the work that you're doing with state leaders and local leaders, because you're taking that wisdom of years of both for-profit and nonprofit work. So thank you for what you do there. Peggy, I want to thank you for the work that you do for teachers, board certified and non-board certified. I know you're across the board, but for the nearly, I guess, less than 5% of our teachers are national board certified, a big push. Thank you for the story about Mississippi. Thank you for the story also about governors, because we know in at least 30 states in the country, K-12 education is a governor's #1 line item budget in his or her budget. So that's important. So thank you for the work you're doing there, and also for diversity based upon gender and race, but also many of the students, young people I met with, many of them are first generation college students. So there's also another aspect of that. Javaid, thank you for the work you continue to do with state leaders, with professors, elected officials, the ones who have to pull the levers and take the tough calls. Although you beat the dead horse, I'm sure you're going to get calls from people who don't like the fact that you're talking about death and beating. We'll get to that at another point. I want to thank all of you for spending time with me. We here at the Center for Education, Leadership, and Culture are here to take the great research we have at the Institute for Advanced Studies and Culture and make it relevant to people who are in policy, people who are in classrooms, people who are at home, people who have no children, have never had children, have too many, have adopted, but who are simply interested in making sure that school matters. As a first-gen college grad myself, who's married to a college professor, and now 3 daughters, and one who's graduated from college, and one who is in elementary school, which shows I've got some other challenges. I know quite well how important education can change the trajectory of one family, but more importantly, to keep the American dream alive for millions of more people. With that, thank you for your time. Thank you, all 3 of you, for joining, and we'll see you for our next event next month.
Thank you, Javaid.